This is the story of how we fought and ultimately prevailed in our long-running battle with an out-of-control HOA board. So, what does it mean when a house is in an HOA? We naively asked the real estate agent back in 1998 while looking at a newly built community in Arizona. My wife and I had both grown up in northern New Jersey, not far from NYC. This is an older part of an older state that had already been well developed. And since most homes were built before the 1980s, HOAs weren't common. We had also lived in New York, about an hour outside of NYC, where it was mostly farm country at the time. Again, no HOAs. Neither of us had ever even heard of one. The agent quickly glossed over it, selling us on how great HOAs are for property values and how they ensure that all homes are well maintained. Back in New Jersey, we occasionally came across that one house in a neighborhood that stood out like a sore thumb. Overgrown weeds, junk cars, trash everywhere, broken windows, and sometimes even a hand-scrawled sign with a bizarre rant about politics or something else. We certainly weren't planning on being one of those homeowners, so if an HOA could prevent that, we figured, why not? It didn't take long to realize the downside. Shortly after moving in, we received a violation notice for putting our garbage cans out 30 minutes too early. Pickup was on Monday, and per the HOA rules, the cans couldn't go out before noon on Sunday. Technically, the board wasn't doing anything illegal, but we soon discovered that they were obsessed with enforcing every rule to the letter. Years later, I received another violation, this time for setting out the trash 2 minutes too early. I remember checking the clock as I was heading out the door. It was 11:55 a.m. I figured, hey, close enough. By the time I get outside, unlock the gate, and put the cans on the curb, it'll be 11:57 or 11:58. 2 days later, I got the violation letter, meaning someone had been patrolling the neighborhood at exactly noon, watching for rule breakers. Landscaping rules were just as strict. The HOA had a list of approved and disallowed plants, along with exact numbers of how many you could and must have. If a plant died, you had to replace it with one from the approved list. If something sprouted on its own, you suddenly had too many plants and had to remove one. One day, new homeowners moved in and, apparently unfamiliar with HOA rules, completely redesigned their front yard without approval. The transformation was stunning, the best-looking yard in the entire neighborhood. But they had used plants from the disallowed list and exceeded the approved quantity. The HOA forced them to remove everything. Even though they had improved their property and boosted curb appeal, the board's rigid rules are rules mentality prevailed. Frustrated, the homeowners took a scorched earth approach in protest, ripping everything out. The lone remaining tree was stripped of its branches, leaving the yard looking like a barren wasteland. Soon after, they received another violation, this time for not having enough plants. Begrudgingly, they installed the bare minimum, then moved away shortly after. We lived there for 8 years. The house itself was a typical new build, quickly constructed and not exactly high quality, which was common in Arizona after building codes were loosened in the late 80s. Wanting something better, we started house hunting again. The first thing we told our real estate agent was, no HOAs. If only we had stuck to that decision, we could have avoided a whole lot of frustration. We started house hunting and came across a home we really liked. The only issue? It was in an HOA. However, our real estate agent assured us that this was a good HOA, not at all like our last experience. And to be fair, he had a point. This community was built in the early 80s, and its covenants, conditions, and restrictions CC and Rs were relatively short. The use restrictions spanned just 2 pages and were essentially the same as city municipal blight codes. Basic rules like keeping garbage cans out of sight and prohibiting livestock, but nothing overly restrictive. What we didn't know was that in previous years, the entire board had been removed, and there had already been 2 lawsuits. So we bought the house, and for nearly 8 years, It seemed like the agent had been right. This was the rare benign HOA. There were no amenities, just a few small common areas, and fees were low at $38 a month. It was easy to forget we even lived in an HOA. As a result, homeowner apathy was rampant. Many properties were rentals or owned by seasonal residents who were completely uninvolved. Hardly anyone attended HOA meetings or paid attention to board decisions, including us, which ultimately opened the door to what came next. Unbeknownst to all of us, the board was slowly being taken over by a man who could best be described as the real-life embodiment of Barney Fife from the Andy Griffith Show. It was a classic case, an older guy with too much free time, a need for control, and a burning desire to clean up the neighborhood. At first, he ran for a board seat uncontested, but once in, he acted as if he had been appointed the dictator of the community. For the sake of the story, I'll refer to him as McFife. McFife was such an unpleasant and combative presence that one by one, as other board members' terms ended, they simply chose not to run again, just to avoid dealing with him. This allowed him to replace them with his hand-picked yes-men who rubber-stamped whatever he wanted. Once he had full control of the board, McFife went on a power trip. They started fining homeowners for things that weren't even prohibited in the CC&Rs, refused to grant hearings, and completely ignored both the bylaws and state laws governing the fine process. The pattern was always the same. Homeowners would receive a violation notice. If they didn't comply within a week, fines would start rolling in, increasing every time, with veiled threats of foreclosure soon to follow, even though unpaid fines can't lead to foreclosure in Arizona. Many homeowners, feeling intimidated, simply complied. That is until they tried to fine us for something that wasn't in the CC&Rs. That's when I had enough. I called them out and made sure others in the community knew what was happening. Their response? A mass crackdown. They flooded the neighborhood with fines, disproportionately targeting people they didn't like while their friends were conveniently exempt. The more homeowners complained, the more fines they issued. In just 8 months, they sent out 5 times the number of fines issued in the previous 3 years combined. To make matters worse, they scheduled the next HOA meeting with just 16 hours' notice, and on a holiday, clearly hoping no one would show up. That backfired. Around 40 homeowners attended, all intent on voicing their frustration. At the end of the meeting, each homeowner was given 2 minutes to speak. What followed was 40 straight minutes of residents openly calling out the board's abuses. They had no real defense, and the meeting ended with a former board member advising them to consult the HOA's attorney if they were unclear on their duties. So they did. The attorney ended up spending 4 hours explaining the CC&Rs, bylaws, and state laws to them because they were apparently incapable of understanding them on their own. In the end, they had no choice but to reverse every single fine they had issued during that period because none of them were valid. It was a significant setback for McFife. For a few months, things were quiet. No new fines, no new controversies. We all thought we had finally reined him in. Little did we know. McFife had other plans. So, after a few months of relative peace, the board was at it again. Here's a highly abbreviated recap of their reign of terror. One of the owners rented out her property, and as the latest tenant had just moved out, she was doing some repairs and maintenance. The garage door and the door leading into the house were open as workers were going in and out. One of the board members, clipboard in hand, walked into the house unannounced and started dictating to the owner all the things they wanted done, inside and out. You'll have to remove that tree. We don't like that kind. We'll provide you with a list of what we approve of. In fact, we really don't like the way your yard is landscaped at all. We want you to redo the whole yard. And here's what we want you to do inside. They were lucky the owner didn't throw them out right then and there. Another owner was having landscaping done in her backyard when the board demanded access to her yard to see what she was doing. despite having no authority to do so. She was originally from NYC, didn't tolerate nonsense, and told them to get lost. Her property backed up to the common area, and later she caught them standing at her back wall, looking over into her yard. The North Side common area was along a very busy street. This stretch had an abundance of well-established trees that had been there for over 30 years, acting as a natural sound barrier and privacy wall. In a stunning display of incompetence, the board decided to turn off the water for the entire summer, when Arizona temperatures regularly exceed 100 degrees Fahrenheit, to save money. Unsurprisingly, about 60% of the trees died. Their solution? We have to cut down the dead trees. But they didn't stop there. The residents whose properties backed up to this area had already clashed with the board over the water shutoff. So, as retaliation, they not only cut down the dead trees, but also every live tree that was opposite the backyards of the homeowners who had complained. So many homeowners protested that the board begrudgingly planted a handful of new trees. But 6 months later, after another dispute with residents, they retaliated again by cutting down every one of the newly planted trees. A year and a half later, they still hadn't planted any new ones, provided residents with any plans to replace them, or given a coherent explanation for why they cut down live trees in the first place. The board's authoritarian behavior. McFife and his minions weren't just about enforcing absurd rules. They also had a clear bias about who they wanted in the neighborhood. I personally overheard him making offensive remarks after a meeting, and once, after a particularly heated discussion, my wife heard him fuming to fellow board members. These people need to learn to do as I say. Anyone who doesn't follow my rules will be punished. They even started hiring a uniformed police officer at $180 per meeting, not for security reasons, but specifically to throw out anyone who dared ask a question they didn't like. The meetings became completely absurd. A typical exchange went like this. Homeowner asks a reasonable question. Board refuses to answer or gives a vague response. Homeowner, but you didn't answer the question. Board, one more word out of you, and we'll have the officer remove you. A friend of ours was actually thrown out after simply asking, "So you either can't or won't answer the question. Which is it?" The HOA president lost his temper, yelling, "That's it! You're out! Officer, get her out of here now! Out! Get out!" Our friend and the officer were laughing as he led her outside. By that point, the damage was done. Homeowners who had shown up just to see if things were as bad as we had claimed were now shaking their heads in disbelief. And then there was the harassment, vandalism, and defamation that was directed toward my wife and me, which started after the infamous Labor Day meeting. It was well known that I was the one who alerted the neighborhood to what was going on, so now I was labeled the neighborhood troublemaker. Frequently, someone would steal my garbage cans and take them 4 blocks away, throwing them into a busy street. The president of the HOA's kid hurled a big rock at my house. I heard it hit and had 2 witnesses, and I had to file a police report. The security lights on the side of my property were damaged. Someone, take a guess who, filed an anonymous complaint with the city claiming that my property had dead trees and an accumulation of garbage, violating the city codes for blight. Of course, none of this was true, and the city inspector came by and promptly closed the case, as my property wasn't in violation of any city codes or any of the community CC&Rs. This, of course, frustrated them to no end, since they couldn't find me for anything. And then there were the monthly newsletters where we were specifically singled out month after month. They took things out of context, misrepresented others, or just outright fabricated complete lies. The highlight of all this nonsense came at the annual meeting, where I got to be the feature of a 20-minute PowerPoint presentation. They went so far as to take my actual emails, chop them up, and piece them together to make it look as if I had said things that I never did. I would have loved to see them try to defend that in court. They tried to portray us as the neighborhood troublemakers who just didn't want to follow the rules. According to them, we were single-handedly bringing the whole community down, turning it into a disaster, driving property values down, etc., etc., and this went on for a full 20 minutes. Virtually everything that was presented was willfully distorted and taken out of context. At one point, I had enough and pointed out that they had misrepresented what I actually said by editing my emails. Their response? They threatened to have the police officer they had hired for the occasion, who would be a regular attendee from this point on, throw me out. It was difficult to keep from going off on them, but I had to hold back because I was looking at the long game, which was to get them removed. Getting into a big argument and being thrown out would have been counterproductive because there were still a lot of people who didn't fully know the truth about what was happening. After they had their say, I nailed them to the wall. I had concrete proof that they had falsified meeting minutes and election results, and I handed out copies to everyone in attendance, laying the groundwork for their eventual downfall. After I revealed that the board had been falsifying meeting minutes and election results, combined with their behavior at the annual meeting, their reputation in the community hit an all-time low. So, for a few months, things were relatively quiet once again. A few months later, we all received a rather large package in the mail from a company called Star Management. Since our HOA only had 99 houses and very little common area, we had always been self-managed, so none of us had any idea who Star Management was. It turned out that the board had decided to hire a management company without telling anyone. Along with the notice about the new management company, the package contained several pages of newly created architectural guidelines. Originally, when the community was built, the only exterior color option was white. Over the years, this had expanded to include various shades of tan and brown. But now, McFife was rolling back those choices with the goal of eventually returning to white only. What followed was 15 pages of newly created use restrictions, rule after rule after rule. The new rules micromanaged every aspect of homeowners' properties: front yard, backyard, even inside their garages. They dictated how long you could leave your garage door open, what could be stored inside, and even tried to regulate aspects of the interior of homes. Essentially, these were the CC and Rs that our very own version of Barney Fife wished he had at his disposal, but since they didn't exist, he simply created them out of thin air. Needless to say, several of us were on the phone with an attorney the very next day. The two attorneys who reviewed the documents were literally laughing and shaking their heads as they read them. Their conclusion? Either the board had just made these up themselves, or if they paid someone for this, they need to ask for their money back. The guidelines were so vague and flexible that they gave the board the power to fine anyone for anything at any time, purely at their discretion. Interpretations could shift from year to year, and board member to board member, leaving homeowners completely in the dark about whether they were in violation of any given rule, until, of course, they started receiving violation letters. And even then, who knew? Maybe the next board would interpret it differently. Under the new rules, 90% of the houses were in violation of something, with most homes having multiple violations. Many of the rules were specifically crafted to target certain people in the community whom they didn't like. I personally found at least 3 rules that had been created just for me. As written and ratified, our attorney believed that if they actually attempted to enforce most of these rules, they would be opening themselves up to repeated lawsuits. To make matters worse, the management company wasn't even going to handle billing. They were specifically hired for the purpose of enforcing the new rules and assessing fines, because the board didn't have the guts to face homeowners themselves. We all knew that they would be providing the management company with a hit list of the people they wanted to go after, while their friends and allies would remain exempt, consistent with their entire track record up to this point. Nothing indicated that would change. Word of what they had done spread like wildfire. Furious neighbors were stopping me in the street, emailing, calling, and even showing up at my front door, all saying variations of the same thing. Who the hell do these people think they are? And what can we do about it? If these were the rules in effect when I looked at this house, I never would have bought it. I would have told the agent to keep looking. I won't live under this nonsense. I'll move first. An open meeting was scheduled a few weeks out, and we were all eagerly anticipating exactly what would transpire. The open board meeting. The board, the new management company that they just hired to enforce all of the fines that they planned on sending out, which they hired without our knowledge, and the HOA attorney, they also had a cop there as well, were all there in addition to at least 25 homeowners. As unhappy as the majority of the homeowners in attendance were, they were overall pretty respectful and reasonable. The board, their attorney, and the management company, on the other hand, came off terribly. They were confrontational, arrogant, evasive, dismissive, and right from the start, clearly adopted an adversarial U.S. versus them mentality. We really didn't have to say very much because their own words and demeanor turned more people against them than anything that we could have said. The first step towards removing the board is to have a petition signed by 25% of the homeowners calling for their removal, 25 people in our case. We already had the petitions prepared, and in the hallway after the meeting, we had furious people lining up and jostling for position to sign it. There were people in attendance who had never been to a board meeting in the 20 to 30 years that they've lived here, who showed up completely outraged by what had been transpiring. Of the 5 board members, one of our neighbors was the only nice and reasonable one. One of our friends pulled her aside after the meeting and asked her if she was in agreement with what was going on, and she said, "No, I'm not any happier about this than you are." Our friend asked her why she was even on the board if she didn't have the spine to voice her opinion, and if she was just going to vote whichever way she was told to by McFife, she may as well just resign. One of the homeowners does the bookkeeping, gets paid $6,000 a year for it too. He showed up late from work, was visibly angry, asked a few questions, was blown off by the board, and stormed out. My wife caught him outside, and he was the first to sign the petition for their removal. Off the top of my head, of the 25 residents in attendance, we obtained 22 signatures, not counting the board, of course. The problem was that we knew for a fact that they would try to rig the election by stuffing the ballot box, making ballots disappear, trying to schedule the meetings and subsequent election on a holiday to prevent us from getting the 20 attendees needed for a quorum for the removal of the board, etc., to show you how out of control this was. The state law says that you have 21 days to contact the board to appeal a violation notice. They changed it to 5 days from the date of the violation. You actually had 5 days to contact them by certified mail, minus however long it took you to receive the violation letter. So basically they had all but eliminated the appeal process. It would seem to me that even if you were legitimately in violation of something, if they refused you a hearing because it took you 7 days to contact them, they would be in violation of state law, and you could get off on a technicality. They couldn't or wouldn't give a straight answer to anything. The lawyer frequently got up and pontificated at length, deflecting the question by droning on and on about something else. When asked about the questionable 5-day appeal process, or direct questions about the ridiculous new use restrictions and how they were going to enforce them, they gave vague, wishy-washy answers like, "Well, we'll consider it case by case. It's a living document subject to amending at any given time." We can't answer that. We'll have to play it by ear. In other words, we're just going to make it up as we go. Days after the meeting, when they found out that a petition was being circulated, they released another of their infamous newsletters, which had previously been used as a sounding board to personally attack us for 9 months straight. It quickly degenerated into a 5-page hysterical rant as they became more and more unhinged, which only confirmed everything that we had been telling people for the previous 9 months. They carried on about how every board before they took over was derelict and incompetent, how the community was spiraling into the toilet, and how they heroically rode in and saved the day for us all. How this community survived for over 30 years without them, we'll never know. Our attorney described it as sanctimonious. They also featured my wife and me in another of their near-monthly personal attacks, essentially painting us as absentee owners who had literally not done any maintenance to the property in a decade. Of course, none of these allegations had any basis in reality. The truth? Things ran far better under previous boards. We personally put in a good $50,000 into improvements to the property since we owned it. We had never paid a single penny in fines in 20 years of living in an HOA. The only reason that we didn't file a civil suit for defamation and harassment was that it would have been counterproductive to do so at that time, as the main goal was getting them removed. We eventually ended up getting 55 signatures out of 99 houses, well over the minimum 25 that we needed. The one reasonable board member that we knew resigned over the whole situation. The homeowner who had been doing the bookkeeping resigned, and the management company they hired wanted out too. One of our friends called the management company, and they told her that they didn't feel the board had been honest with them. When they saw that a large percentage of the homeowners were furious with the board, they wanted out. The board was required by law to schedule a meeting where we would be voting on whether or not the remaining 4 board members would be removed. But they took a business-as-usual stance, sticking their heads in the sand and acting as if nothing was happening. We anticipated that they would try to delay the meeting and vote as long as possible, hoping that things would cool down, people would go out of town for the summer, and maybe they could avoid being removed if apathy set in and people didn't show up to the meeting or bother to vote. We also knew that this was really only a short-term solution that just pushed the problem down the road for someone else to deal with later. Once things settled down, homeowner complacency and apathy would inevitably return. People wouldn't attend meetings, wouldn't vote in board elections, wouldn't run for the board, and eventually the same people would get back on the board the same way they got in the first place, by running uncontested. But in the short term, we still lived there, and just trying to sell our house with those new rules in effect would make it much more difficult. Early on, our attorney tried to reason with the board and their attorney. Their response: they basically told us to get lost and challenged us to take them to court, without considering that we could simply go the recall route and get them all removed. I did a search on the attorney that the board was using and found at least 4 articles where she had represented HOA boards against lawsuits filed by homeowners. Clearly, this is just what she does. After everything hit the fan, she tried to cover herself. I saw an email where she lied to her boss, claiming that she hadn't been kept informed of what the old board had been doing. The problem? We had her on tape at one of the meetings, lecturing us and the board, essentially telling us outright that this was a dictatorship, that they had the power to make up whatever rules they wanted, and that there was nothing we could do about it. How wrong they later found out they were. They're lucky it didn't end up in court. We had concrete proof of the attorney's lies and of the board committing fraud, falsifying meeting minutes, and rigging election results. And they knew that I knew all of the above. They also knew that we weren't going to back down or go away. So, in the end, they really had no choice but to follow through with the recall election. In the weeks leading up to the recall election, they released a few more of their notorious newsletters, the last of which was a 4-page tirade filled with the usual personal attacks that I had come to expect on a monthly basis. It also included fear-based attempts to scare people into not removing them, claiming that the community would spiral into the toilet without them to lead us. It was filled with so many half-truths, things taken out of context, and outright lies that it would have taken an hour to address it all. They were also making highly inflated claims about the legal costs they said we were causing them to incur. However, they did rack up $6,000 in legal fees just to create all of their new rules, then ran up another $4,000 plus fighting tooth and nail not to get thrown out. Later on, after McFife was removed, he caused the HOA to incur another $2,000 plus in legal fees because he kept sending threatening letters to the new board members' homes, the management company, and the HOA attorney. He also put up a website, sent out flyers to the whole community with pictures of everything he didn't like, and generally continued harassing people. They did exactly what I expected, reacting like children having a tantrum. They decided to go out kicking and screaming, racking up bills that the budget couldn't afford, all to pursue their personal agenda and maintain their position on the board at any cost. They never showed up to the recall election, so the attorney and staff ran things. As expected, they tried to rig the election with bogus mail-in ballots. It wasn't too hard to figure out that about half a dozen snowbirds, absentee owners, etc., were almost certainly out of town and unlikely to show up or vote. But we also knew that even that wouldn't save them. In the end, it didn't matter. They lost by a landslide, and all 4 of them were removed. An election was scheduled to appoint a new board. The conclusion of the meeting was pretty funny because I happened to be standing by the exit door, and everyone wanted to shake my hand on the way out, like it was a receiving line. At least half a dozen people came up afterward to personally thank me for all the time and hard work I had put into getting this done, which I appreciated. We anticipated that the now former board members would still try to contest the results somehow, but they never did, because they had no legal basis on which to do so. After the recall, a new board was elected. McFife actually tried to run for the board again, even though he had just been thrown out and wasn't even eligible. To make it even funnier, my wife got elected. And whether by accident or design, she had the honor at the next board meeting of officially announcing to everyone that all of the ridiculous rules the old board had created had been removed. Among the many problems with what the old board had done, they had essentially committed fraud with the paperwork they had filed. At the first meeting of the new board, the new HOA attorney even commented, "It's virtually unheard of for 2 people to get an entire board removed, and it must have been a lot of work." No kidding. It cost us $5,000 plus in legal fees, and at times I was putting in 25 to 30 hours a week on it. In the following months, McFife seemed to become more and more unhinged. He started sending threatening and harassing letters to board members' homes, the management company, and the HOA attorney. The attorney handled him, but when he didn't get what he wanted, his crazy rules reinstated, he completely lost it. He and his wife started regularly patrolling the neighborhood with clipboards and cameras in hand. We still hadn't sold our old house yet, and at one point, our real estate agent got a call from an agent who had just tried to show the house. Apparently, McFife had confronted them and the potential buyers in our driveway, telling them, "If you buy this house, you had better maintain it the way I like. The previous owners have been warned repeatedly, and now so have you." Needless to say, it did not leave the buyers with the best impression of the neighborhood. I had to email him and let him know that if I got one more call about agents or buyers being harassed, I would call our attorney and have a restraining order taken out against him. That seemed to put an end to it. A few months later, he was at it again, this time sending out a multi-page tirade filled with wild claims and conspiracy theories about the new board. He demanded that his rules be reinstated. He claimed he had been defamed and was expecting an apology. He posted pictures of houses he didn't approve of. He insisted that the community was spiraling into the toilet and on the verge of becoming a ghetto. He claimed that only by reinstating himself and his former board could the neighborhood be saved from the abyss. He declared that every previous board was derelict in their duties, and that only he and his minions knew what was best for the community. He even put up a website dedicated to his insanity. It looked a bit like the old Time Cube website. Random fonts, different colors, bizarre layouts. McFife was strutting around the neighborhood, extraordinarily pleased with himself, as if he had actually accomplished something significant. The rest of the neighborhood, not so much, especially the homeowners whose houses were photographed and featured in his newsletter and website. To illustrate just how dishonest he was, one resident had a flat tire, jacked up their car, and put on the spare. McFife photographed the car while it was still on the jack and featured it in his newsletter, trying to make it look like the car had been sitting that way for months. The next board meeting was coming up, and I think he believed he was going to turn the community against the new board. What actually happened? A room full of angry people who showed up just to yell at him. Another former board member almost got into a fight with one of the homeowners. For his part, McFife slunk out at the end of the meeting, getting cursed out by some of the residents as he left. His website wasn't up for very long either, because he posted videos of recent board meetings without permission. So, we were able to get his domain name taken down. But apparently you can't keep a good kook down, because McFife and one of his minions ran for the board again at the next election. Out of 30 votes cast, he and his puppet received a grand total of 3 votes. His last newsletter and website had officially killed off what little support he had left. He and his wife were now the pariahs of the neighborhood. At the end of the meeting, he stood up with a prepared statement, with copies for anyone who wanted it. My wife had had enough and wasn't about to sit through another rant. She just got up and said, "That's it. I'm officially done with this," and walked out, since her duties as secretary were over. I have no doubt that he'll try again next year, but it's no longer our problem, since we finally sold our old house. Needless to say, my experiences living in HOAs were not positive ones. Board positions are a magnet for every little would-be dictator to live out their fantasies of abusing power. HOAs also seem to bring out the worst in human nature. I think the way my wife described it was petty judgmental bickering. In our case, the board's attitude was, "Only we know what is best for the community. You people are too stupid to know what's good for you. Just give us your money, shut up, and do as you are told." They convinced themselves that they were in the right, and like zealots, they believed any action was justifiable because to them, the ends justified the means. The root of all the issues came down to McFife. His minions were incapable of accomplishing anything on their own and simply followed his directives. The guy genuinely has something wrong with him mentally. He goes through life bullying, blustering, conning, and intimidating people into doing what he wants. He carries himself with an air of superiority, acting like he's the smartest person in the room, when in reality he may well be the dumbest. But he manages to con a lot of people because they think he seems pretty confident and acts like he really knows what he's doing. If you call him out and stand up to him, he has no answer, because he really doesn't know what he's doing and doesn't even understand what you're saying. When I quoted the bylaws, CC and Rs, and state statutes to prove that what he was doing was invalid, he just shut down, and his response was, "This is not up for discussion." Translation: why can't you just shut up and do what I say like everyone else does? He was so arrogant and out of control that at one point he was actually trying to argue HOA law with the HOA attorney. Once he got booted from the board and lost his power base, watching him melt down was like watching someone with OCD who couldn't perform their rituals. The guy seemed to totally lose it. It was never about doing what was best for the community. It was always about feeding their egos, abusing their power, and controlling, dominating, and micromanaging the lives and properties of everyone in the neighborhood. This guy and his minions will continue to be a nuisance to the people living there for years to come. The HOA cycle repeats itself. Once we moved, I figured that was the last I would hear about the old HOA. Well, 6 months later, I got an email from one of our old neighbors. He wanted the name of the HOA attorney we had hired to help us oust the old board. Apparently, according to him, the new board was slowly starting to resemble the old one. New rules, new fines, selective enforcement, holding meetings with minimal notice so no one would show up, manipulating the rules to serve personal agendas. He felt that it was going to blow up again and eventually end up in court, so he figured he better get in touch with an attorney sooner rather than later. This didn't surprise me at all, and it was part of the reason we moved. I had been concerned that once a new board took control, it would eventually turn into the same mess. I was already hearing rumors and grumblings of discontent just before we sold. I'm convinced that some of these people will never be happy with any board. The only board they would be happy with is one they are the president of, and even then, they would complain about all the work they had to do. New people get on the board, each with their own agendas, grudges, pet peeves, etc. They let the power go to their heads, and before long, they start fixing things, ruling over the community with an iron fist, because, after all, a dictatorship is fine as long as you're the one in control. The more things change, the more they stay the same in HOA land. It's a broken system, a failed experiment, and further confirmation of the Petri dish principle that I posted about earlier. If years ago I had known what I know now about HOAs, I never would have bought a house in one. Forget HOAs. Never again. The saga continues. Edit. After I wrote all of the above, but before I had the chance to post it, I just heard from some of our old neighbors yesterday. Apparently McFife, frustrated that neither he nor his minions have been able to get back on the board, has just put his protest website back up. At least this time, he was smart enough to be a little more low-key than the off-the-wall lunacy he had up before. Back when we still lived there, McFife actually moved his office into the vacant office space next door to the management company, so he could spy on them. My wife was on the board at the time, and she was certain he was listening in on the management company. Why? Because he was bringing up things at meetings that she had only talked to them about over the phone. How else could he know? At the time, people thought she was just being paranoid, but apparently not, because since then, the management company had to install a noise-canceling device in their office. And now, the latest update? He cost the HOA $1,800 last year in legal fees trying to sue the management company and the board. Somehow, I'm not missing any of this.